Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Webinar Wednesday. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ria Stark, and I'm the Digital Engagement Manager here at TLC. And if you were able to join us last time, you got to learn all about what to do in the event of a ransomware attack and how to respond quickly to protect your library's data. If you missed that webinar, you can catch the replay of it at tlcdelivers.com/webinars. But continuing that theme, today we'll be discussing how to respond to other kinds of IT nightmares, specifically creating a disaster response plan, ideally before you need one. Of course, we do hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Before we dive into our content, let me run through my usual reminders. First, we are live this Wednesday afternoon, and so thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us. And as a live participant, you have the opportunity to ask our panelist questions. So if you think of anything, please add them to the questions panel throughout the presentation, and we'll address those at the end. And to get the best value out of it, please be sure to do that. You are live. We appreciate you being able to participate with us. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar again later, we encourage that. We encourage you sharing it with your colleagues, and you can catch the replay tomorrow. Again, that address is tlcdelivers.com/webinars. And before you log out today, just be sure to grab those handouts for more information. So in order to kick off today's content, we want to start with a poll. There are a number of you in our audience today, so we want to get a feel for where you're at with our content level. So in just a moment, you'll see a poll appear on your screen. And when that pops up, please let us know how many of you already have a disaster response plan. Maybe you're not even sure what a disaster response plan is, and that's okay. We'll go over it. If you don't already have a plan, have you needed one in the past? Maybe your library is lucky enough to not have needed one, or maybe you wish you had one when you didn't. If you have some fun stories, add those to the questions panel. That'd be good to hear at the end. And maybe you already have a response plan, or maybe you're in the process of creating one. And if you do have one, have you needed to use it? So a number of different options for you available there. We'll let that open for just a second, give folks a chance to respond. Looks like there's some good answers coming in. We'll get those results in just a moment. All right. Oh, good. It looks like about 62% of you have one or are in the process of creating one, but 24% no, and thankfully we haven't needed one. Well, we're glad you're here in our session today, so hopefully you can start creating one before you need it. So before we jump in, I do have a quick disclaimer. Every information system is different. So today's webinar will help define terms, talk about some real world scenarios, but mostly help create guidelines for you to take back to your technology teams to come up with the best plan for your organization. All right, please join me in welcoming back our panelist, Joe Reimers, who is the sales engineer for our Carl Solution ILS. But long before that, he served many years on the library front lines and has a few stories to tell from that time. Joe, thank you for joining us again for Webinar Wednesday.
Thank you, Ria. And I'm going to begin with one of those stories from about 20 years ago. This literally did happen to me when I was the ILS administrator at an academic law library for a fairly well-known university. At the time, we were an on-premise solution, so we had the server in the corner. We did our own backups, but we had a service contract with our ILS vendor to manage and repair the hardware and everything. Anyway, one day I started noticing the backups were failing. I would try to verify the backups and it wouldn't come out, or would come out with errors. And it happened a couple of days. So I contacted the vendor and said, hey, I'm having trouble with the backups. Tried switching to fresh tapes. That didn't work. And they said, okay, we're going to send you a new tape drive. So they sent me a new tape drive, and a couple of days later I got it. I brought the system down to install the new tape drive, and wouldn't you know, the system would not come back up. Chose that moment to decide that the power supply was done. So now we went from having a backup problem to having no system. We were hard down. So I contacted the vendor again and said, we are now hard down. That got resolved within a couple of days, but there were a couple of hiccups. So we had no system for 3 days, and we had about 4 or 5 days worth of backups that weren't any good. Now, I had requested that remote backups be done during that, but when they brought everything up, they realized the remote backups had never occurred. So when we came back online after several days, we realized we were missing nearly a week's worth of circulation transactions, a week's worth of cataloging, a week's worth of acquisitions. We had barcoded and spine labeled materials on the shelves that were not recorded anywhere in the system. We didn't know the status of some ILL requests. In other words, it was a nightmare, and we had to figure it all out. We ended up figuring it out. It took us, as mentioned, we were back up within a couple of days, but it took us nearly a month before we were back in our more or less original state, having recovered everything we possibly could. So as Ria mentioned, I am the Carl Solution Sales Engineer. I'm also a librarian, and I've spent about 19 years doing library IT and ILS systems administration. And today we are going to talk about disaster response. And I'm going to refer back to my little tale of woe a few times because it illustrates a number of points. We want to start with defining a disaster because it's important to know what you're responding to. We're going to discuss some of the other key elements of a disaster response plan and discuss some of the best practices that we've found in formulating and thinking about how to approach a disaster response plan. So now I believe we are going to go to another poll.
Thanks, Joe. That's my cue. So in just a few moments, you'll have another poll up on your screen, and we are wondering where your data sits. So where that lives will impact how your library responds to a disaster and possibly whether your data is impacted at all. So please go ahead and fill out that poll. And we're wondering, is your ILS hosted or is it on-premise? And if it is hosted, are you hosting through your ILS vendor? Or maybe you're hosting through a local or a city, county IT, somewhere close to you, but not necessarily through the ILS vendor. If you're one of our TLC customers, it's possible you are hosted with us through TLC Cloud Services or possibly through our co-location model. So that might be an option for you. And I know many of our customers have enjoyed being on TLC Cloud Services. It's been beneficial to them, especially during hurricane season recently. It's been nice to have their data hosted. So just curious where everyone's at. Looks like about 42% are on-premise and 33% are hosted through the ILS vendor. So good data. Thank you for letting us ask that. Joe, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Ria. So the first step in creating a disaster response plan is defining what is a disaster. And in this case, we're talking specifically about an IT disaster. Many libraries have other sorts of disaster response plans, which form a good basic framework for how to approach this. For instance, dealing with fire, flood, or natural disaster. But it's also important to have IT disasters and frame those. What I have on the screen here is not a canonical or comprehensive list, but merely possible types of disasters to think about. So loss of mission critical data, for instance, I mentioned with my tale from many years ago, we were down for 3 days. Loss of services for 3 days is serious business, but it was relatively straightforward. The headache came from those missing backups and that missing data and how to reconstruct that. Another disaster is if you have a leak or breach of sensitive or personal information. If your patron information gets leaked, if employment information gets leaked, how do you respond to that? Are you dealing with external attacks impacting service, such as a ransomware attack, as we discussed a few weeks ago? Service outages, and this can be a real feast or famine. So if you're on premise and you're managing your own hardware, a service outage can be a very, very big headache because you have to fix the server and figure out where the problem is. Whereas if you're hosted, it might be a relatively minor thing because it's simply a phone call and then let your hosting provider solve it. At the end of the day, a disaster really depends on how damaging is it to you, how much of a headache is it to restore, and It's very individualized based on your particular circumstances. So with regard to disaster recovery goals, once you understand what the disaster is, then the goals are to understand the priorities in recovering from that disaster. And that means restoring an order of criticality, understanding what needs to happen when, understanding who needs to do what, and also communicating with stakeholders. So keeping people informed, making sure people don't come in. But the communication should also be in a way that does not interfere with restoration efforts. So if you have somebody who's trying to fix the problem and they have to stop every 2 minutes to answer the phone to say, what's the status, that can interfere with these restoration efforts. Now we're going to clarify a couple of terms that will help further frame these goals. These are a little bit of techie terms, and we're going to talk about RTO and RPO, which are the recovery time objective and recovery point objective. And this really frames the realistic parameters for a response. So your RTO is your recovery time objective, which is another way of saying how long can we afford to be down, or how quickly can we get back up? And recovery can have a number of meanings, but basically it means generally back in business. As I mentioned, with my disaster, we were back up after 3 days. And this was way back when we had to replace hardware and get new systems in place and manually restore everything. And 3 days was a longer time than we would have liked. But it's how quickly you can get back up. Whereas with a hosted solution, that recovery time is more likely to be measured in hours. Your recovery point objective is how much data measured in hours are we willing to lose, or how often do we back up? So more frequent backups mean a shorter recovery point objective. Both of these are necessary because while we ideally have no pain, there's also what are we willing to tolerate. There are some guidelines surrounding RTO and RPO. So we talk about 3 nines, 4 nines with regard to availability, particularly with cloud hosting. As mentioned, when we went down, our RTO was supposed to be for 2 business days because we had to physically get servers shipped out. And there were some complications which slowed that down. But today, particularly when you're dealing with hosting, you'll see 99% availability, 99.9% availability, 99.99% availability. What that really means, so if you see 99.9% availability, that translates to 8 hours and 45 minutes. 99.99 is, I believe, 54 minutes and change, something like that. But typically when you see that sort of availability, if you have a cloud hosting provider promising 99.9% availability, you will be up in under 9 hours. Similarly with RPO, the library standard is 24 hours, which translates to a nightly backup. So inherent in that is if you're working in the middle of the day and things go down, anything that happens between your last backup and when the system goes down, assuming that the hard drive is unrecoverable, that the data is unrecoverable, that is going to be lost, and you somehow have to account for what you're going to do with that missing data. That is your recovery point objective. And there usually will be some stuff that goes missing. Fortunately, it's very, very rare. But occasionally it does happen. And again, it's a question of how do you manage that? We do often get asked about having a lower RTO and a lower RPO, or higher availability, lower RPO. That technology does exist. We do get asked about it, but it can be cost prohibitive for most libraries. We've been asked several times about, can we just have a server on hot standby that just fails over so we don't ever lose anything? And we can do that. The technology is there, but it gets very, very, very expensive because you have to have another server ready and you have to build in additional tools to copy that information back and forth. You're essentially running two servers. So some of the best practices with regard to establishing a good disaster response plan. Once you've defined what a disaster is or what the various disasters are and thought about what needs to happen with those, and you've figured out what reasonable recovery times and recovery points are, then you need to figure out the individual pieces. So as mentioned before, having a communication and coordination plan is critical. You want to set up the communication in a way that does not interfere with the actual recovery itself, but also keeps all stakeholders informed as to what needs to happen. It's also important to structure that communication and coordination plan in a way that makes sense given the nature of the disaster. So if your ILS goes down, email is going to be a very effective way to notify people quickly that the system is down and what's going on with that. On the other hand, if you're dealing with a ransomware attack or a wholesale internet outage, email isn't going to work and you'll need to move to some alternate communication plan such as phone trees or similar. I would also recommend having a separate communication coordinator from the person people directly responsible for the restoration efforts themselves. The next important best practice is crawl, then walk, then run. Get the basic stuff first, achieve what you can achieve, and then move up in order of criticality, go from critical to less critical and achievable to more difficult. So again, thinking back to what we had, we were back up and running within about 3.5 days. And as time went on, we restored what we could as we could. And it wasn't what was restored about a month later were really the niggling details regarding items that were on the shelf that had to be recataloged or dealing with acquisitions that had been sent out, but for which the information was lost in the lost data. But it was really the less critical stuff that still needed to be addressed. So we restored the important stuff first, reestablished circulation activities right away, and then recovered from there. Another key best practice is to assign responsibilities to roles rather than to people. And the reason for that is people change, jobs evolve, roles evolve, and it's important that when duties are assigned to roles, you have greater continuity, you have more consistency in training, you have better knowledge sharing. And then you want to test your plan. So it's important when you can to take time to simulate a disaster, test your protocols, test your procedures, make sure things work, make sure people know what needs to happen. If you have a dry run, that's a simulated disaster. Then when the real thing hits, you'll have a much better idea what to do, and you'll know where things might need to be modified, adjusted, or tweaked. I also strongly recommend building redundancy in response roles. If you have a situation where everything depends on one person with the knowledge and the credentials to do what needs to be done, if that person is on vacation in Aruba, then you have no plan. There needs to be some sort of fallback where somebody else can get in there and do that. And I've seen situations in small libraries in particular, where there is one person who has access to all of the credentials and logins. And what they would do, and this was many, many years ago, but what they would do is they would write down the credentials and passwords and seal them in an envelope saying basically break in case of emergency, so that you would keep confidential, sensitive credentials in a protected place. And then if that envelope got ripped open, then you would, set new passwords and so forth. So that's one approach that could work. Another important point is the disaster response plan needs to be accessible to all stakeholders. So if I have duties in the event of a disaster, and I don't know that I have duties and I don't know where I can find the response plan, again, we don't really have a plan because I can't participate in it. So make sure that the disaster response plan is accessible to all stakeholders. And it's important to review the plan as roles, services, and circumstances change, because people do move on, people do change jobs, knowledge changes, systems change, and things evolve. You may have to change passwords. You may decide you want to rethink how fundamental things happen. But review the plan. Make sure you've accounted for everything. As mentioned with our disaster, one of the things we learned is we had a plan for an outage, but we had to make up a plan on the fly for what to do if we lost several days of transactions and cataloging and acquisitions, because we hadn't thought fully through what having that kind of outage would mean. Granted, it was a very, very, very rare sort of confluence of two different types of disasters. Normally, the one should have covered the other. But in this case, we had two come together that resulted in a dramatic outage. And, document what you did, think through how would you approach that, what would you have to do so that it doesn't, so that if it happens, you're prepared. So in conclusion, when putting together a disaster response plan, the very first thing to mention is that having a plan is far superior to having no plan. A lot of times, quick response can be important, particularly if you're dealing with something like a ransomware attack, or you're dealing with a service outage, or you've got sensitive data exposed. You want to seal that off quickly. You want to prioritize critical functions. So crawl before you walk, walk before you run, and build in redundancy. Make sure that there's always a fallback so that somebody can react quickly and appropriately, especially when time counts. Test your plan, update your plan as needed, and make your plan available and accessible to all your stakeholders. And at this point, I believe we are on deck for another poll question.
Yep, thank you, Joe. We just have a few more poll questions, and then we'll get to our attendee questions. So if you are thinking about a question, go ahead and drop it into that questions panel. We'll get to those in just a moment. So this next poll, we are curious to know whether or not you are responsible for creating or updating your library's disaster response plan. So now that you're armed with more information about it, does this fall within your wheelhouse? Either creating a new one for those of you who at the top of the call said you don't have one currently, or are you the one that's supposed to update and maintain it? Or maybe you work very closely with those teams, or potentially you contract that out through some contracted IT work. So just curious to know where you land on that. I see a few questions coming in. We'll get to those just shortly. Please feel free to add some more if you'd like. All right, we should have our results shortly. So the majority, this is a nice split. So 35, no, this is handled by someone else in my organization. 30% yes, this task belongs to me or my department, and 26% not directly, but I work closely with that person or team. So it's good to be able to at least have that information, even if you're not directly responsible for it, in case you're the one that is brought into the conversation because something happened, or you're with one of those people that notices something first. All right, we have one last poll question for you, and then we'll jump into the questions. So this is the one we ask at the end of every webinar, and it's whether or not you'd like more information from TLC about our products and services. So maybe this is within your wheelhouse and you haven't had to create a response plan before, and you would like to know more information about that. Go ahead and hit that yes button, and we will be sure to reach out with following this webinar with some more information specific to your library. All right, this is also a good time to mention that we do have joining us for our question and answer session. You will hear the voice of our Chief Technology Officer, Justin Duelzanizer, is joining us as well. He's called in, so we won't be able to see his camera, but if there's a couple of questions, you might hear his voice. All right, well, we'll get that going. Joe, I'm going to go ahead and start with these questions. The first one that came in was, what are the options of moving the backup data to a virtual or hosted solution in case of an emergency to get the system back up?
So there are a variety of options available to that. In general, I'm a big fan of cloud-hosted solutions. And even if you're self-hosted and you want to back up to the cloud, I would strongly recommend doing that because cloud hosting providers do have their own redundancy plans. They do their own backups, and a lot of them have offsite storage or geographic redundancy. So there are multiple layers of redundancy in place, especially, and this is especially true if you live in an area that is particularly susceptible to natural disasters or flooding or other areas that might compromise your existing backups. So cloud backup in general is a good idea as a secondary or tertiary fallback if you're hosted on premise. If you're cloud hosted, then it should already be built in. Although if you're dealing with a colo facility, a co-location facility or a local hosting provider, I would definitely check with them and ask if they do offsite backups or have reciprocal backups with other co-location facilities to make sure that your data is properly secured just in case.
Thank you, Joe. And one of our handouts today is our cloud hosting, excuse me, TLC Cloud Services product sheet. So if you want more information about TLC's cloud hosting enterprise provider, go ahead and check that out. We don't have it as a handout, but on our website, one of our case studies for one library that had that exact same thing happen where they went down and we were able to move them over to the cloud very quickly. So be sure to check out our case studies later on our website. And Justin, I wanted to give you an option to jump in as well if you wanted to on that question too.
Oh, thank you. I was chomping at the bit. Yes. I completely agree with everything that Joe said. And one thing I would throw on top of that is, so if you're working with a vendor like TLC, obviously we're very familiar with the library space. And so we think about the type of data that we're receiving and how it should be handled, particularly around patron data, student data, rules and regulations around that. So completely agree with what Joe said. You do want to make sure that if you're going to any third party to store information off site, that you do think about what kind of information, how sensitive it is, and what the rules are for handling that, and how much access you can or cannot give to the service provider to that data, or whether they technically become a subcontractor. I don't want to go too detailed on that, but just generally speaking, before you do that, make sure you pause and think, what am I sharing and what are the rules around what I'm sharing here? Because even if it's just data storage for a point of recovery, there may be considerations to pay attention to from an information security and access standpoint.
Great, thank you, Justin. We do have one more question that came in. Do you have any examples of simple plans for libraries to get started that you can share?
So right now, I don't have a good example of a simple plan, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First, TLC is not a library, therefore our disaster response plan is necessarily going to be very, very different because we have different responsibilities, different security protocols, and different types of things that we need to maintain. And secondly, as we mentioned, every library is different. So even, comparing a small library to another small library, whether you are hosted or on premise makes a difference. Your relationship with city or county IT makes a difference. And I would certainly encourage you actually to reach out to your local county IT departments for those sorts of conversations, because they're going to have a better understanding of local rules and regulations, and will also be able to provide better localized guidelines in that regard. So as much as I would love to provide that, that's why we provided the disclaimer at the beginning that every library is different, every library is unique, and that's why we love libraries. But it also means that there is no blanket, yes, we can do this.
Yeah, and I'll also add to that as well that our community listservs are a great place to pull the rest of the customer base as well to see if maybe they have an example, at least just to get started. But everything Joe said, once you have that, just be sure to run that through your current city IT or within your organization.
And I would also check your institutional disaster response plan for non-IT events as an additional point of reference. It won't help with all of the IT issues, but it will help establish good parameters for what should be in there.
And I'll add this follow-up question or similar question from a different person asking who might be involved in a response plan. Joe, you talked about assigning it to the role rather than the person, so maybe you might be able to elaborate on what some of those roles are, and that at least as a starter plan.
So with our little mini disaster that we had many, many years ago, there were 3 of us who were primarily responsible for that response. And it was the head of technical services, the chief database maintenance / cataloging librarian, and me, who was the systems coordinator. So that basically covered somebody overseeing the whole thing and directing traffic, somebody managing the technical aspect, and somebody managing the data aspect. And there was redundancy among the 3 positions so that we could all cover for one another. We were an academic library, so our interest level was much smaller. In a public library, I would also factor in someone in communications or reference or in a similar role who can act as a liaison to the community to communicate anything there that needs to happen. If you're dealing with a ransomware attack or a data breach, you might also need to have someone in the business office or bring in someone from legal as a just in case. But I would generally recommend, depending on the nature of the disaster, you're always going to have at least 1 or 2 people from the IT side involved, at least 1 or 2 people from technical services, and somebody in library administration.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions we have so far. Justin, I also wanted to give you another chance to jump in if there's any closing thoughts you wanted to share or any additional suggestions.
Yeah, I think Joe laid it out pretty well, and a good place to start is, the specifics of what you're trying to cover from a system and a process will change the details of these roles or how many people you need with different specialties. But really starting from who are the, technical systems workers who will work on the recovery. So that's generally your kind of IT side doers. It's often a good idea to have a coordinator, somebody who is responsible for making sure that everything that needs to happen around the process happens and takes that off of the plate of the people who are focused on achieving the recovery objective. And then as Joe highlighted, somebody responsible for internal communications, so keeping stakeholders informed of what's going on, answering questions internally, et cetera. Somebody involved in public communications, depending on the nature of the issue. So obviously, if we're in a kind of public service or a public role, then there's a public audience there with interest in what's going on, may have concerns, may be impacted, et cetera. So having a public communications piece, and then as necessary legal, depending on what the implications are. That's a pretty good place to start. And then it's usually breaking things down at a more specific and detailed level within those groups of roles. And of course, depending on, the size of your organization, what you're responsible for, some of those can be the same people potentially, but the primary and one backup at a minimum from a role perspective still applies there, because you want to be able to execute that, in all kinds of circumstances that would happen in real time as we move through the world.
Exactly. Thank you, Justin. Joe, any closing thoughts before we jump to our last slide? I'm not seeing any other questions so far.
No, my only last thought is think it through carefully. It's perfectly fine to do multiple iterations because, as I mentioned, things do come up that you would not necessarily have considered. I mean, if as a young systems administrator, I would not have thought that the lost transactional data would be the major headache I had to deal with. I would have thought that the system down would be the major headache, and then we'd have to restore that. So those kinds of things did come as a surprise. So take time, think through all the ramifications and what all is involved. But again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Get a plan in place and then evolve that plan as things grow and change.
Yeah, anything worth doing is worth doing. You know, get started on it and then go from there. All right, if you wouldn't mind going to our last slide, Joe, just a few last closing reminders. We are planning on having one more webinar before the end of the year, so keep an eye out for details on that, likely following the Thanksgiving holiday. And we did just finish up our TLCU user conference earlier this month. If you are joining us here and you heard about Webinar Wednesday for the first time at the conference, welcome. We're so glad to have you. And also thank you for participating in the conference if you got a chance to. Remember to grab your handouts before you log out. And I did see Justin Larson added our link to the case studies, so be sure to read through those and find out more information from us there. And then the last note is that for our current customers who do undergo some sort of disaster or potentially a local tragedy, TLC support team is here to assist you. So from updating circulation dates to bulk updating collection statuses, whatever the case may be, TLC support is here to assist. So thank you everyone so much for your time today and for joining us for TLC's Webinar Wednesday. We'll be sure to see you on the next one, and happy Thanksgiving to all of our customers and attendees in the United States. We'll see you next time.